I join Wes in welcoming you here tonight, or to be with us tonight, and indeed we are studying from Judges chapter 19. Now, as we study the book of Judges, we've noted this time and again, this is a book of failures. This is a book where they are in the promised land. This is that nation of slaves that came out of Egypt, organized by God, led through the wilderness. They're in the land of milk and honey, and they're turning it into a land of iniquity. The chapters we're currently studying, having already surveyed the bulk of the book of Judges, are actually describing some events that take place early during the period of the Judges. We've already outlined this book, calling the first two chapters disobedience. They were supposed to drive all the inhabitants of the land out of the land from before them. They didn't do it. Then we've looked at chapters 3 through 16, deterioration. The bulk of the book of Judges, the study of 13 of those 15 judges. Now we're in the last section of the book, chapters 17 through 21. It's desolation. But again, we have to emphasize this desolation does not occur at the end of the period of Judges. It happens quickly. When we get to chapter 20, we're going to read about Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the high priest. Phinehas was high priest shortly after they entered into the land, and Eleazar, his father, died. Thus, this puts Phinehas serving as high priest, again, very early during this time period. When we look at chapters 17 and 18, we titled that Homemade Religion. And we looked at that in terms of And talking about homemade religion, we looked at Micah's man-made religion. We also looked at Dan's clan-made religion. Micah with his house of gods, his misguided mother, his own misguided practices, his self-appointed priest, and then those men of Dan that were looking for another place for many of the family of Dan to live, and they stay with Micah. They go on and they find a place called Laish, and then on their way back to conquer Laish, they swing by Micah's house and rob him blind, because that's what good neighbors do, right? That's the behavior of the people during this time period. When we come to chapter 19, whereas chapters 17 and 18 were homemade religion, chapter 19, it's homemade righteousness. And homemade righteousness is not real righteousness. You'll remember Paul told the Romans concerning his brethren, the Hebrews, I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge, Romans 10, verse 2. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness, going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. When we are looking for what's right in our own eyes, and that was the case of the Hebrews during this time period. Every man did what's right in his own eyes. It's pointed out in chapter 17, verse 6. It's pointed out in the first verse of chapter 18. It's pointed out for us in the first verse of chapter 19, when there was no king in Israel. Righteousness is fluid, at least in their mindsets. And we're going to see where that leads in this chapter. Over the course of the chapters to come, we'll label chapter 19 homicide, because that's ultimately where it leads. But chapter 19 is just a dress rehearsal for where chapter 20 is going to go. It's genocide. And then as a result of their genocide and genocidal rage, we're going to get to chapter 21, where they're going to be stealing brides in order to compensate for their genocide. And if you think those major headings are a sad picture, here's the course that it takes. Chapter 19 is going to begin with adultery and infidelity. From there will be apathy and indifference toward the well-being of others, inhospitality, and other indicators. From there's going to be pride, and we'll discuss that. Rape, to the point of murder. And as a solution for the rape and murder, instead of simply punishing those that were involved, one tribe tries to defend its own bloodkin that were involved, and so the 11 other tribes engage in the genocide. Genocide was the solution for homicide. And then they go to stealing brides in reaction to their genocide. And by the way, when you stop and think about this, they're stealing brides. They'll kill all the men of Jabesh Gilead. And then when there aren't enough women, after killing all the men in Jabesh Gilead and taking the women that haven't known a man, chapter 21, they're going to go to Shiloh, where the virgin daughters go out seasonally to dance, and they're going to steal those virgin daughters and force them to become men's wives. Quite the pretty picture, isn't it? This is desolation at its worst. These are not chapters that we read and look for who's the example of what to do. Not a soul is truly an example of who we'd want to be. But the sobering idea when we look at these chapters is not so much looking for examples of what to be or what not to be, but asking, how close is our society to this already? Let's pick up in chapter 19. And we'll study this tonight. Now again, the primary heading is going to be homicide. But we need to begin at the beginning. Chapter 19, verse 1, it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite sojourning on the side of Mount Ephraim. A Levite sojourning. Now in the book of Numbers, it specified that they are to receive 48 cities throughout the land. Levites should not have had to sojourn anywhere, but this is not the first Levite we've seen sojourning. Do you remember back in chapter 17, that Levite that came out of Bethlehem, Judah, verse 8, to sojourn where he could find a place? It looks like the Levites aren't able to live at the place where God had designated, apparently because the people were not supplying the tithe and the contribution to God's work that God had dictated. And so now those that are supposed to be holy, those that are supposed to be the example and the servers at the tabernacle, they're sojourning in different places, staying in temporary spots. Verse 1, this Levi sojourned on the side of Mount Ephraim. Now, the Levites had cities in Ephraim, but again, he's sojourning. He's not in a home. He sojourned in Mount Ephraim, and he took him a concubine out of Bethlehem, Judah. As we study this chapter, we're going to see plenty of indicators about the moral deterioration that's taking place. Their homemade righteousness is ultimately going to lead to homicide. But as we build this up, let's think about where this Levite is. Now, he's in Ephraim. Mount Ephraim would be the eastern portion of Ephraim, much like we discussed when we talked about this man Micah back in Judges chapters 17 and 18. In Ephraim is where the tabernacle was currently located, in Shiloh. Matter of fact, that is pointed out at the end of Judges chapter 18. This is a Levite that is sojourning, and he's not far from where the tabernacle is located in his sojourn. He takes a wife from Bethlehem, Judah. Now, she's not called a wife here, she's called a concubine, which means we need to look at this word concubine for just a moment, because there are some things that we cannot assume. First, our heading here is going to be infidelity. But let's look at where that begins. This wife, the concubine, the word concubine appears some 37 times in the New King James Version of the Old Testament. A concubine can be described as a subsequent wife. And by that we mean this. 1 Chronicles 1:32, Keturah is described as Abraham's concubine. But if we compare that with Genesis 25:1, Keturah was a bride that Abraham apparently married after the death of Sarah. Now, there are those that would insist and assert, no, Abraham married her before the death of Sarah. But let's just step back and think about this for a moment. Abraham, the friend of God, who'd already messed up by siring a child with Hagar, who would qualify as a concubine, is he going to go and sire other children with another woman contrary to God's will? When by the time we got to Genesis 18, God was saying, I know him. He's going to command his children and his family after him to follow my ways, to do my will. God's law has always been one man, one woman. No matter what the Hebrews did, no matter what their kings did, going all the way back to the Garden of Eden, to the creation of Eve, a man shall leave father, mother, cleave to his wife, the two shall be one flesh. A concubine. When we look at it in terms of Abraham, it was a subsequent wife, but also, and other passages would show that it could be a wife that was married, that could qualify as a second wife that a widower married, which seems to have been the case with Abraham and Keturah. But the word was also used to describe a servant wife. It could be used to describe Hagar, with whom Abraham sired a child in an ungodly way. The term concubine can be used to describe Bilhah. In fact, it was. Bilhah was the handmaid of Rachel, Rachel being the wife of Jacob. And when Rachel could not bear her husband children, she gave her handmaid Bilhah to her husband, to wife, is how it's described in Genesis 30, verses 1 through 6. But Bilhah is described as a concubine, Genesis 35:22. So when we talk about concubines, we're talking about someone that's never described as a primary wife or an initial wife or a first wife. A concubine is always either a subsequent wife that a widower takes, or, and in many cases, an additional wife that's taken in a way contrary to God's will. Now, when it comes to this Levite that we're studying here, he was either a widower who had remarried, or he was committing polygamy. Some would accuse Moses of polygamy. Moses had another wife. Read Numbers 11. Oh, you go back and read Numbers 11. Because nothing is stated, one, that this wife that was of Cushite, this wife that was of another land, nothing stated that would rule out the potential of that being Zipporah. And also, nothing stated that would rule out the potential of Zipporah having died and Moses remarried. So we can't accuse Moses of polygamy. When Abraham entered into it, he paid the price for it. And any other time it occurs in Scripture is a demonstration of God's patience with these people, not his acceptance of the practice. Side note, there are certain laws, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that talk about the potential for when there are multiple wives. See, that means God condoned it. Those laws have to be understood with the rest of God's law. God also said that when a man dies and has no children, then his wife is to marry the man's brother to bring up a child. Now that law is given whether the brother is married or not. Thus there is a law that would necessitate multiple wives in the case, and only in the case, of that levirate law of bringing up a child for a deceased brother. That's the only time polygamy in the Old Testament would be acceptable. Now, as we talk about this Levite in Judges chapter 19, there's nothing to indicate one way or another whether he's remarried, whether this is polygamy. So we'll just move forward looking at his situation, and we'll take a look at what his concubine has done. Judges 19, picking up at verse 2, his concubine played the harlot against him. That means she committed adultery. It's translated play the whore, play the harlot, commit adultery. Anytime it is used in Scripture, it is indicating fornication. So here is a wife who has played the harlot against her husband, and then she went away to her father's house in Bethlehem, Judah. So she cheated on her husband, then she ran home to daddy. Let's go ahead and start right here asking a question about the different characters we're going to meet along this journey. Was she a good wife? I think we can reasonably say no. The one that commits infidelity, now we're not given any background on her husband or the nature of the marriage. If we assume the best, then this is a remarriage of a widower, and she's committed adultery. If we assume the worst, she's still committed adultery. No matter what the case, she's played the harlot. Inspiration gives us that description. She's run home to her father's house. She stays there 4 months. Now, we already know, thou shalt not commit adultery, Exodus 20. We already know that when a man is caught with another man's wife, they are to be stoned, according to Leviticus 20 and verse 10. And yes, there would be allowances regarding the punishment, but the point here being, she was guilty. She'd violated God's law. Guilty of infidelity. She's run home to daddy. What does her husband do? Verse 3. Her husband arose and went after her to speak friendly unto her and to bring her again, having his servant with him and a couple of asses, and she brought him into her father's house. When the father of the damsel saw him, he rejoiced to meet him. Now there's a lot said in this verse. This man goes to retrieve his wife, to bring her home from her father's house. And in this case, she didn't go home to mama, she went home to daddy. But he goes to get her and to speak kindly to her. Now this description would be used in Genesis 34 of Shechem, who had laid with Dinah and then came to speak comfortably to her and about her to her father. Or we think about what's later said concerning Hosea. When Hosea has allowed Gomer to face the music for what she's done, he then says, Hosea 2:14, I'll go and I'll speak comfortably to her, speak kindly to her. This word is frequently used of the tone of voice needed for reconciliation. It's said of God in Jerusalem, Isaiah 40 and verse 2, speak comfortably to Jerusalem. So here, consoling, kind words. Here's a man bringing roses and trying to convince her that everything can be made okay. Now, she's the one that left, but he's come trying to reconcile the marriage. But we're not going to ask if he's a good husband yet. We want to go ahead and let him show us who he really is. He came to speak to her, and she brings him into daddy's house. So she's apparently happy to see him when he speaks kindly to her, which does make us wonder how he spoke to her when she was at home. But her father's happy to receive him as well. So here we have a big happy family. And they all lived happily ever after, right? Well, we pick up at verse 4. Verse 4, his father-in-law, the damsel's father, retained him, and he abode with him 3 days. So they did eat and drink and lodge there. They're having a good time, spending time together. Verse 5, it came to pass in the 4th day, when they arose early in the morning, that he arose up to depart. It's time to go. We've got to get back. The damsel's father said unto his son-in-law, comfort thine heart with a morsel of bread, and afterward go your way. Why don't you stay and have a nice big breakfast, then you can hit the road. Well, apparently he tried to cook a Shoney's breakfast with an oversized buffet, because by the time they finished eating, verse 6, they sat down together and did eat and drink, both of them together. For the damsel's father had said unto the man, be content, I pray thee, and tarry all night, and let thine heart be merry. Daddy wanted them to stay another night, but he starts with a big breakfast. After they arise from the meal, the day is pressed onward. Apparently breakfast ran into lunch, but verse 7, when the man arose up to depart, his father-in-law urged him, therefore he lodged there again. So he goes, he stays 4 days, retrieving his bride, seeming to demonstrate not only gentleness but patience. He goes to retrieve her, he speaks comfortably, kindly. Daddy says, well, stay another day. Well, okay. Stay another meal. All right. Stay another night. Okay, one more night. But now, verse 8, He arose early in the morning on the 5th day to depart. The damsel's father said, Comfort thine heart, I pray thee. And they tarried until afternoon. Here's another big breakfast. And they did eat both of them, but by this point the Levite can see what's coming. And so, verse 9, when the man rose up to depart, he and his concubine and his servant, his father-in-law, the damsel's father, did what in-laws always do when it's time to leave. No, stay a little bit longer. He says, Behold, now the day draweth toward evening, and I pray you tarry all night. Behold, the day groweth to an end. Lodge here, that thine heart may be merry, and tomorrow get you early on your way, that thou mayest go home. Most son-in-laws have heard this before. Well, just stay one more night, and you can get on the road really early in the morning. You know what's going to happen in the morning if he stays overnight, right? Oh, why don't you hang around and have another big meal? Just one meal at a time, one night at a time. He's going to get them to stay. It's day 5, midday. They're getting a late start. But they're getting a late start because this Levite has been patient. An earlier start would have been better, as events will demonstrate. Verse 10, the man would not tarry that night, but he rose up and departed and came over against Jebus, which is Jerusalem. And there were with him 2 asses saddled. His concubine also was with him. And when they were by Jebus, that is Jerusalem, the day was far spent, and the servant said to his master, Come, I pray thee, let us turn into this city of the Jebusites and lodge in it. Let's hit the pause button right here. Now, as they travel, they come near to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a city that belonged to Benjamin. But the Benjamites had not taken it, according to chapter 1, verse 21. The Jebusites lived there. Now, this city is called the city of Salem, city of peace, back in Genesis chapter 14. When Abraham returns from the battle with those kings from the east, Chedorlaomer and his confederates, and Melchizedek comes out to meet him. Melchizedek is king of Salem. Salem means peace. Salem is this same city. Here it's called Jebus. Jebus, Salem. Can you see where the name is derived? Jerusalem. We say Jerusalem, but that's the etymology thereof. Jebusites, Salem. Jerusalem was supposed to belong to Benjamin, but they'd not driven out the Jebusites. So as this man of Levi passes by en route to his home in the mountains of Ephraim, his servant says, Hey, let's stay here with the Jebusites. Notice his reaction. Verse 12, his master said unto him, We will not turn aside thither into the city of a stranger that is not of the children of Israel. We will pass over to Gibeah. Gibeah, that's where he wanted to go. A city that belonged to Israelites. Jerusalem, not safe there, not a good idea. Let's go to a city of our own people. Now let's move forward. We've seen the infidelity, and the infidelity appears to be reconciled. But as we move forward, now let's look at some indifference. It begins with their arrival in the city. Verse 13, he tells his servant, Come, let us draw near to one of these places to lodge all night, in Gibeah or in Ramah. And they passed on and went their way. The sun went down upon them when they were by Gibeah. So it's late in the evening, sundown. They're near Gibeah, so they go into the city at dusk. Gibeah belongs to Benjamin, again pointed out here. Verse 14, they turned aside thither, so they're entering a city of their kinsmen. They go to lodge in Gibeah. They need a place to stay. When he entered in, he sat him down in a street of the city, for there was no man that took them into his house to lodging. There's no hospitality. This is not very Hebrew. This is not very child of Abraham. Remember when Abraham saw company coming, Genesis 18, 1 and 2? He arose, ran to meet them, bowed down on his face. My Lord, stay with me. Well, Abraham knew that was God coming. Whether he knew it was God coming or not, he exercised hospitality. The kind of hospitality that later the Hebrews writer apparently references when he says, be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares, Hebrews 13:1. Or we think about Lot. Lot might be an even better example of hospitality to remember. Lot sat in the city gate, and when he saw visitors coming, he did the same thing Abraham did, Genesis 19:1 and 2. He ran, he bowed his face to the ground, and he pleaded with them, come stay at my place. In fact, with what we're about to read, it might be a good idea to mark Genesis 19, because we're going to have to read some of those verses again. So this man of Gibeah, this man of Levi arrives in Gibeah. He enters the city. There's no one to greet him, no one to take him in, no one to give them a lodging. So he sits down and he waits. Eventually, picking up at verse 16, behold, there came an old man from his work out of the field at even, which was also of Mount Ephraim, and he sojourned in Gibeah. But the men of the place were Benjamites. So here comes a stranger to the city. He's a temporary resident, a sojourner. It's not his home. But he's working in the fields. He's staying in the city. And when he comes into this city, now remember, he's not from around here. He's from a little bit further north. He sees the Levites staying in the street. Verse 17, when he lifted up his eyes, he saw a wayfaring man in the street of the city, and the old man said, whither goest thou? And whence comest thou? Where are you going? Where have you been? A good question to ask, especially given the nature of this city. Oftentimes, the Hebrew greeting was simply, peace be unto you. Salam. Here, this old man proceeds cautiously. Where are you going? Where have you been? Almost as though he's not sure whether he can trust his visitor. But as the Levite responds, verse 18, he says, we're passing from Bethlehem, Judah. That's where I've been. He doesn't say, I had to go get my wife. She ran off. He says, we're passing from Bethlehem, Judah, toward the side of Mount Ephraim. And from thence am I. I live in Mount Ephraim. I went to Bethlehem, Judah, but I am now going to the house of the Lord, and there is no man that receiveth me to house. The King James Version at the end of this verse seems to say that his destination is Shiloh, the house of the Lord. But he's already pointed out he's going to his place in Mount Ephraim. And the sense here is not so much I'm going directly to the house of the Lord as it is I'm allowed to work in the house of the Lord, but there's nobody in this town that'll let me in his house. I labor at the tabernacle. I serve in God's house, but nobody here will let me under his roof. He's not only observing, but lamenting the lack of hospitality being demonstrated. A lack of hospitality is a lack of love, a lack of care, a lack of concern for one's well-being. Now, yes, there are times when we're limited on how many we can house, but not a soul in Gibeah stopped to offer this man anything for his benefit. Not until this elderly gentleman enters the city, who lives there, but he's not from there. Now, when he hears the Levite lament that no one's offered him a place to stay, picking up at verse 19, the Levite proceeds to say, there's both straw and provender for our asses. There's bread and wine also for me and for thy handmaid. He refers to his concubine, his wife, as the handmaid. In other words, we're thy servants. We have all the food we need for us and for our animals and for the young man that's with thy servants. There's no want of anything. We're not going to be a burden to anyone. We're not going to clean out anyone's pantry. We're not going to ransack anyone's cupboard. We are not going to leave it looking like they've been looted. We've got all we need. We're looking for a roof over our heads for the night. Verse 20. The old man said, here's that greeting. Peace be with thee. It's the greeting he didn't give earlier. But now he essentially says, welcome. Now that he knows who this is and what's taking place. Again, apparently because of where he lived, he knew to be cautious. Apparently because of where he lived, he knew that he couldn't let just anyone into his house either. But he at least exercised enough hospitality to check and see what kind of individual this was. Who are you? Where are you going? Where have you been? He learns that it's a Levite with seemingly good intentions. Peace be with you, he says. Howsoever, let all thou wants lie upon me, only lodge not in the street. I'll take care of everything. Let all your wants, all your needs, I'll feed you dinner. I'll give you beverage. I'll take care of it. I'll foot the bill. I'll cover the cost. I'll exercise some hospitality. You just don't sleep in the street here. You don't stay out on these streets. Because when you're out on the street, you either don't sleep or you don't know how you're going to wake up. It's the case in many places today that have the same moral fiber as the place that we are about to investigate. This man enters into the home of the elderly gentleman, verse 21. So he brought him into his house and gave provender unto the asses. They washed their feet, did eat and drink. Now this is hospitality. The kind of hospitality the apostles didn't even show whenever they didn't wash anyone's feet prior to the Lord's Supper being instituted. Something to note here. We already observed we probably need to mark Genesis 19. Let's flip back and notice how similar this sounds to something that Lot would say. Genesis 19. Lot would tell his visitors, verse 2, Behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house. Tarry all night, wash your feet, sound familiar? And you'll get up early and you're going to get out of town. You rise up early and go on your way. They say, no, we'll just sleep on the street. We will abide in the street all night. Lot knew that the street was not a place for them to sleep. Because when you sleep on the street, you either don't sleep or you don't know how you'll wake up. Verse 3, He pressed upon them greatly, and they turned in unto him, and entered his house, and he made them a feast, and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. He's taking care of them. Sounds a lot like this man in Gibeah. The parallels don't stop there. We return to Judges chapter 19, and we pick up at verse 22. Now there's indifference in this city. Indifference on the part of the residents to the needs of a stranger. It takes a non-resident who's just staying there to take care of the needs of a stranger. So in terms of what's taking place in their society, there's infidelity. There's indifference. And now, we know it's not a good town. We know she hadn't been a good wife. But that's not the only character or characters we need to investigate. Let's note at this point the inhumanity. Picking up at verse 22. As they were making their hearts merry, they're feasting, they're enjoying their time together, they're having a comfortable evening. Behold, the men of the city, certain sons of Belial, worthless men is what it literally means, beset the house round about and beat at the door and spake to the master of the house, the old man, saying, Bring forth the man that came unto thine house, that we may know him. Not a good wife, not a good town, and now we're looking at not a good people. The men are making a demand, send him out. And they're not trying to meet him and shake his hand. They had an opportunity to do that when it was daylight. But now, under cover of darkness and with a mob mentality, they have a desire. And that desire is to know him. And to know him means to force a will upon him. This is not just about attraction. This is not just about homosexual attraction. There's far more taking place here. Let's keep moving forward as we read. Verse 23, the master of the house, went out unto the people and said to them, Nay, my brethren, he's trying to identify with them. Nay, my brethren, nay, I pray you, do not so wickedly, seeing that this man has come into my house. Do not this folly. Let's hit the pause button. And let's notice how this sounds a lot like Genesis 19. Pick up at verse 4 in Genesis 19. When they lay down, before they lay down, Genesis 19:4, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round about, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. They called unto Lot and said unto him, Where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. Lot went out the door unto them and shut the door after him and said, I pray you, brethren, sound familiar? Send out your visitors so that we can know them. The host exits. Don't do this. Nay, my brethren, that's how he begins. I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. But now I have 2 daughters, Lot says, which haven't known a man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out to you, and you do to them what's good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing. For therefore they came under the shadow of my roof. They've come into my house for my protection. That's what Lot said. Verse 9 of Genesis 19. The men said, Stand back. Then they said, Oh, look, this one came in to sojourn. He's not a resident here. He's not from here. Sound familiar? He's not from here, but he's judging us. We're going to be harder on you than we were on, we're going to be on your visitor. Genesis 19, we're familiar with it. Sodom and Gomorrah. The destruction. Judges chapter 19. God's people in God's land have deteriorated to the point of acting like Sodom. Not only the people encircling the house, banging on the door and demanding to rape the male visitor, but also the reaction of the host. Remember, Lot had been in Sodom for too long. By the time he had these men banging on his door, he actually offered them his daughters. There's no excuse for that. Oh, Lot was trying to protect his visitors. He needed to be a father also. And at this point, he'd put himself in a situation where being a host and being a father could not both take place. That's how iniquity-ridden Sodom was. Gibeah is just that desolate. Verse 23, returning to Judges 19. They're banging on the door. Send them out so that we can know them. The man of the house pleads with them. No, my brethren, don't do this wickedly. This man's in my house. Don't do this folly. I'm protecting him, much like Lot said. Verse 24. Behold, here's my daughter, a maiden. Here's my daughter. She's a virgin. Take her. And his concubine. Them I'll bring out now. And you humble them. You hang on to that word, humble. You humble them, and do with them what seemeth good unto you. But unto this man do not so vile a thing. Like there was no excuse for Lot, there is no excuse for this man. So, not a good wife, not a good town, not a good people, and not a good host. I said hang on to that word humble a moment. When we get to verse 25, the men of the town are going to take the concubine, and they knew her and abused her all the night. How much like Sodom is Gibeah? Their sin is not just sexual in nature. That's just an expression of what they've really become. Ezekiel 16, picking up at verse 49, the exiled prophet would describe the sin of Sodom when he says, "Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom, pride, fullness of bread, abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters, neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy." In Sodom, they had everything they needed. They were prideful, they were arrogant, they were full of bread, they were idle, and they wouldn't help a soul. Sound like Gibeah? Prideful, arrogant. They've got what they need, but they wouldn't help a soul. Ezekiel 16, verse 50, "And they were haughty and committed abomination before me." It was arrogance that led to everything else. It's arrogance that says, God can't tell me how to live. I love who I want to love. It's arrogance that says, you can't tell me what to do. I'll be what I want to be. And this arrogance, manifested in whatever direction of preference, has an outcome that is described twice in Scripture, both of which leave our stomachs churning. It's pride, arrogance that brought about the behavior of Sodom. It's pride and arrogance that brought about the behavior of the people in Gibeah. And do not miss, for a single instant, do not miss what they did to this concubine. Judges 19:25. The men would not hearken to him. They wouldn't listen to the old man that said, don't do so wickedly, don't do so vile a thing, don't do this. So the man took his concubine. Notice the daughter is not mentioned here. He takes the concubine, he brought her forth unto them, and they knew her and abused her all the night until the morning. These are some of the most painful verses of Scripture to read. The grotesqueness of the crime that they are committing challenges our very vocabulary. The word translated abused, it doesn't just mean hurt. The word carries the idea of working over. The word is used to describe what God did to Egypt when He overcame them and mocked them. The word is translated mocking elsewhere in Scripture. The word is alal. So here, this idea of they abused her is they worked her over and mocked her. This is not simply an act of passion. This is not simply misguided acting on attraction, neither of which can be justified. This is arrogance. This is an effort to prove I can do what I want to you and you can't stop me. And the mindset that says, I can do what I want with me and you can't stop me, is only a step away from saying, I'll do what I want to you. And you can't stop that either. That's the mindset in Gibeah. I have to ask, how many people have that mindset today? Let's hit the pause button. Let's back up, because this misguided concept of righteousness and I'll do what's right to me begins with misguided religion. I'll do what seems right religiously to me. How many people are going off in this direction? Oh, will they all end up committing atrocities that churn the stomach as much as this? No. But why would I dare venture down this path? Now these men of Gibeah are abusing, mocking, degrading, turning her into an object of shame and physical pleasure throughout the course of the night. We pick up at verse 26. We've already asked, had she been a good wife? No. But did that mean that she had earned this? Absolutely not. Was this a good town? No. Were these good people? No. That host was not a good father. I'll bring you my daughter. Nor was he a good host. I'll bring you my guest's wife, which he actually did. Verse 26. Then came the one, at the end of verse 25, after they had abused her all the night until the morning, when the day began to spring, they let her go. Because again, they lived in a city that never slept. And they did their deeds in the night. As the day begins to dawn, like rats, they scurry back to their holes. They let her go. Verse 26, then came the woman in the dawning of the day, and fell down at the door of the man's house where her Lord was, till it was light. The sun's coming up. She can't even get in the house. She fell down at the door. I dare say that gives you an idea of how she arrived. An injured, barely walk, perhaps crawl, as she finds her way back to the one place that was supposed to be a place of safety. Yes, she'd been unfaithful to her husband. Why didn't he tell the man of the house, no, you're not sending her out there? Instead, he allowed her to be sent out to suffer the abuse that they had intended for him. Now, that's not a husband. That's never what a husband was intended to be. The twain shall be one flesh. Not the twain shall be one flesh until you can put the other one in the way of danger to save your own hide. Not a good wife. No. Not a good town, not a good people, not a good father, not a good host, and now not a good husband. If we hit the pause button right here and ask, who did what was right in this chapter? Nobody. Nobody. Everyone's actions contributed. That doesn't mean everyone's actions deserve the outcome. But one of the most atrocious truths of this chapter and those that follow is that so often the perpetrator becomes the next victim, to the point that we almost feel sorry for the previous perpetrator, and in this case do. That's how degraded their society has become. It's been said, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Well, so far, 6 don't either. Verse 27. She's laying at the door. The morning sun has risen. Her Lord rose up in the morning, opened the doors of the house, and went out to go his way. Apparently, he never expected to see her again. But here she is at the door. And behold, the woman, his concubine, was fallen down at the door of the house. Her hands were upon the threshold. She'd come that far. And he says to her, up, let's go. That's a sensitive husband, isn't it? Not only did he send her out to be abused, but in the morning, knowing what she had endured, he looks at her limp frame and says, get up, let's go. Come on, let's get out of here. At best, it's insensitive. At worst, it's inhuman. The inhumanity of this chapter does not only reside with the rapists and murderers. It resides with the father that was willing to send his daughter out to them, a husband willing to send his wife out to them. Infidelity, indifference, and inhumanity. And it doesn't stop here. Verse 28, he said to her, up, let us be going, but none answered. Then the man took her up upon an ass, and he rose up and gat him unto his place. He went home. Then verse 29. What he does to her is similar to the verbiage used in Leviticus 1:6 in describing what's to be done to an animal that has been slaughtered for a burnt offering and cut into its pieces. He's a Levite. Maybe this is what he's seen taking place at the tabernacle. And so now he's going to do it to his bride in order to make a point throughout the land. Verse 29, when he was come into his house, he took a knife, lay hold on his concubine, her body, and divided her together with her bones. In other words, he separates her body at the point of joints, elbows, shoulders, pelvis, knees, apparently wrists, ankles. That gives 12 portions, and he's still able to bury the most part of her. 12 portions, and what does he do with them? Sent her to all the coasts of Israel. Does this scene make you sick? Here's a man that went to retrieve his wife, who'd ran away from him. She'd played the harlot and left. He speaks comfortably to her. He has dinner with Daddy for 4 straight nights. He seems so gentle and patient. I wonder if she thought he was a changed man, that he actually cared. Here's a city that doesn't care about the well-being of those on the streets, but they'll sure impose their will, defile them, and leave them saying, look what I did to you. A father willing to submit his daughter to that, a husband willing to submit his wife to it. And now the husband takes the body of his wife home, and sends her pieces, one to each tribe. That's quite the package to receive. Notice the impact that it had. Verse 30. And it was so that all that saw it said, there was no such deed done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt unto this day. Consider it. Take advice. Speak your minds. They actually assess and rightly conclude, we have gotten as low as we've ever been. Nothing like this has happened in Israel. From the time we came out of Egypt and became a nation unto this day, this is the worst atrocity we have ever witnessed. But by the time we get to the end of the book of Judges, we'll see more. Over the course of the next 2 chapters, the atrocities will grow. Keep in mind, this begins with infidelity, inhospitality, and inhumanity that involves murder and rape. And by the time that the nation has worked its way around to solving the problems that have come from this, they are going to resort to murder and rape. This is a society that should make us sick. Their society is hypersexualized. Their society is arrogant. We can